In this clip, I'd like to share a method of how I track vintage drum machines and samplers into my DAW, and why I like to do it this way. So whether you've got an 808, a 909, or an SP1200, or even an MPC of some sort, old or new, it shouldn't make too much of a difference. As long as you have multiple outputs and can generate a click of some sort, it should all work the same. And you can do it fairly easily. You'll only be limited to however many inputs your audio interface has. If you have 8 or more, that's the ideal situation. If you only have 4, you can still use this method. It could be done with 2, but it'll be fairly tedious. If you find the clip useful, let me know by hitting the thumbs up, subscribe, and check out the channel for more clips just like this one. So first of all, what I try to achieve with whichever vintage box we're using is the preservation of the unique movement generated by their internal clocks, which should include everything from swing to the slight speeding up and slowing down of their individual feel and tempo, because if you choose to sync them and slave them or trigger them from an external sequencer, that does change the feel. It might well be a different device with different architecture, and so you could potentially be adopting a different feel opposed to the original internal clock of a vintage drum machine. And whether you have a multi-clock or a Korg KMS30 or possibly some other device, the moment you slave your vintage box is the moment they disconnect from 1984 or whichever year they came from, but also the moment they await the pace of your 2021 DAW or whichever device you slave them to. But the way I think of it is kind of funny, really. I imagine having the late great Clyde Stubblefield in my studio, arguably the most sampled drummer in music history. For those that don't know Clyde was a drummer for James Brown for many years. But imagine having the luxury of Clyde Stubblefield in your studio for a few hours. Would you be telling him how to play the beat, or would you just hit record and let him go for it? Because essentially, slaving those vintage boxes to your DAW is telling them how to play the beat. And a super precise modern DAW would be instructing them on exactly what to do and when to do it. Now, there's nothing wrong with using a DAW to do that, because a DAW can offer rock-solid timing. But ultimately, you would be bypassing the clocks in those vintage boxes that were engineered 20, 30 or 40 years ago. And they are different. They didn't build that kind of precision into 80s drum machines, like a modern DAW. And that's why they strut differently. They're from a much more basic era. And that basic feel gets lost in the translation of sync. Those vintage boxes do their thing very differently to modern day DAWs. They don't adhere to the protocols of modern day DAWs, which is why they can be difficult to sync up and why they're prone to drift. Plus, their swings are different, and in most cases, there's 10 times more resolution in one quarter note from a modern day DAW compared to a quarter note of, say, an MPC 3000. But what some might see as their shortcomings are their vintage and their character, which to me is the spirit I like to capture rather than replace. Because for many, that is the heart and soul of an SP1200 or an 808 or an MPC or whatever. And it's not just limited to the attraction of that particular box's sonic qualities, but also its feel. And it can get tricky because some people like to work with their standalone boxes in sync with their DAW, like a sidecar, which is also a popular scenario. I was doing that myself. But after a little while, I couldn't help feel like something was off. It just didn't have the same vibe. It was like something sucked the air out of the room every time I used my DAW as a sync master. And there's more on that topic shortly. But for me, I tend to prefer the feel and the swings from the internal clocks of vintage boxes. They just seem to loop around a rhythm pattern purely content on just making it around, rather than making it around at exactly 85.000 beats per minute with atomic clock accuracy. Maybe it's just part of being human. I don't know why this is the case for me, but I'm not alone on this one. And I definitely gel and respond with improvisation more fluently against the internal clocks of an old comp rhythm or an 808. They just have a nice feel, and they're not trying to be so perfect and precise. But then humans aren't either. And so if you dive a little deeper, you might notice the different personalities across different sequencer manufacturers Like an SP1200 swing is different to a Roland 909 swing, and the MPC swings change from model to model. But for me, or as a beat maker, I like that. Much like a drummer can perform different feels, I like having access to different swings and shuffles, because if variety is the spice of life, then having a few vintage boxes gives you a few spices to choose from. I'm sure most of you know this, but rhythm and feel are important aspects to any song. They're the foundations of your song. You build your blocks on top of them. But with so many people using DAWs these days, the feel seems to be taking a little bit of a back seat, and what's left are straight grid lines calculated by the project tempo and a handful of default quantizers. For those reasons, I like to draw on other sources that aren't so robotic or precise, to preserve a little bit of that vintage feel as much as I can. So if you're on the same train of thought, you've probably wondered, how do I get that swing or that stomp or that shuffle or wonky vibe out of my MPC undisturbed? How do you preserve something like that against such a mathematically perfect grid? Or the way I term it is, how do you bottle that hot sauce and get it faithfully into your DAW in a way that would lock whatever box you have in line with the project tempo of whatever DAW you're using? Well, the method I use is quite abrasive, but it captures the spirit I'm after quite well. So let's say we have a beat like I've prepared here on the MPC 3000, and I apologize in advance for how basic it is, but it's just for an example. But what I do is route my MPC sounds out the MPC's individual outputs into separate channels into my DAW's audio interface, but then I reserve the last channel to play the MPC's metronome. Then moving over to the DAW, I punch in the tempo that's in my MPC as my DAW project tempo, exactly as it's displayed on my MPC, decimal point values included. Then I record enable all the relative tracks in the DAW in preparation to record my MPC, turn on the DAW metronome, cue my song pointer on bar 2, just so I've got plenty of lead time. Then on my MPC, I make sure I've got a blank sequence, hit record in the DAW, wait for the click, and play the MPC or SP1200, etc. on the downbeat of my metronome, and play whatever sequences I need. As long as they all share the same BPM, you'll be fine. As it's recording, I can make any live tweaks that I need and record however much I need. You could record an entire arrangement if you like. I've done this up to 256 bars without any problems. And the good thing is, once it's done, I can then edit using the cut and paste methods inside my DAW. Finally, in preparation for the wrap-up, I cue the blank sequence, and what that does is allows your metronome to continue running so that the audio tails of your 8 tracks don't get clipped when you stop. Once you've tracked your recording, what I do next is I group the 8 or so tracks and phase lock them. And phase locking is intended for situations where you have a live drummer on a drum kit and you can't afford to have their hi-hat mic fall out of sync with the audio captured by the other mics. Because if you do time stretch one mic of a drum kit without phase locking, you'll hear the cymbals or a snare in the background bleed out of time with the rest of the kit and create all kinds of phasing issues. So phase locking, or quantize locking as it's now referred to in Logic, locks the integrity of the timing across however many tracks you group together. That means we can faithfully time stretch all tracks at the same time without anything moving independently of the group, and doing so retains the integrity of the phase precisely. So for the cherry on the cake, with the help of Elastic Audio, I then flex or warp the first MPC click from the metronome track onto the first bar of the DAW. And then stretch the last metronome click into position that matches up with the same bar count from the MPC, but on the DAW's timeline. And then that's locked. But not only that, everything in between is undisturbed. Sure, it may be 0.001% time stretch, but like slowing down a record or speeding it up by that much, you've still got the original impression of what went down to tape, undisturbed, so to speak. Then if you're a real greedy guts, you can come back and record another 8 over the top of itself as a second pass, and keep adding parts to your heart's content. So potentially you could have 2 or 3 SP1200s over the top of each other with phase accurate timing based around their original internal clocks. Or even if you only have a 4 input audio interface, you can get the 8 outputs or more out of your standalone boxes, and quite accurately too. So sure, there's a few steps involved, but it's on the grid and it's that swing that everyone's talking about. So whether you prefer to sync with a Genlock, a multi-clock, a KMS30, a Roland SPX, or just the MIDI ports from your audio interface, the debate really isn't do they do a good job, because they do. They do great jobs, but they're the messengers. Let's not forget that. The DAWs by default are running off their own internal clock, which is something of extreme precision in comparison. They do their best to relay the integrity of samples within each frame, thousands of times per second. And they too also require word clocks to keep them in sync with each other, which is testament to the fact that drift does exist across all levels, even with these modern super fast processors, compared to the processors inside vintage samplers made 30 plus years ago. Anyway, that's just a method I wanted to share because a few people have asked me, how do you integrate the old dogs with new tricks? And while it's entirely possible either way, the choice is yours. And if you're happy with your DAW's internal clock and want your standalone box to sync up with Logic or whatever DAW, then let's quickly visit some of the common options we have in most standalone machines like the MPC, SP1200, etc. You may see an option for MTC, MIDI timecode. MIDI timecode is more or less like a Serato type of sync protocol, but a lot more primitive. So if you need to be able to jump to, say for example, 2 minutes and 15 seconds into your DAW project, and you're using your MPC in song mode, then MIDI timecode is the option you want. But if you have a 909 or an SP1200 and just play sequences on the fly, then MTC is not going to be much use to you, because if you have a 4-bar or an 8-bar loop or a 16-bar loop, they won't contain a point that you can jump to that is 2 minutes and 15 seconds long. You might play it on repeat for 2 hours, but there is no 2 minutes and 15 seconds that the MTC can position the playhead at. Not within a 16 or 32 bar loop anyway. So if you're making beats or recording parts on a box in say 4 or 8 bar sequences, then MTC is already too much. It's overkill. You'd really just need MIDI clock for that kind of workflow. And to make your day worse, if you're unsure of what to put and have a few of these sync options all enabled at the same time, then it's likely you'll be flooding the MIDI channel on your drum machine with streams of unnecessary MIDI data. And that could and does congest MIDI events on the way to your devices. In some cases, you might even notice a few MIDI notes disappearing here and there. And just as a side note on MIDI, MIDI is transmitted asynchronously at 31,250 bits per second. So when you play a chord, even when quantized, the notes in that chord are shot out of your MIDI interface to your standalone box, byte after byte. They don't all arrive on the same bar as you'd expect. They arrive very quickly, but they do arrive sequentially, one byte after another. Not only that, those data packets take longer to arrive over longer lengths of MIDI cable. So MIDI isn't really all that robust, nor is it that reliable. The longer your MIDI cables are, the more latency you invoke, but it is 40 years old, so it's done incredibly well for its age. But in terms of modern day DAWs, MIDI cables are no match for the kind of sample accurate precision being generated by a modern DAW. And then MIDI isn't as reliable as the innards of a standalone box that triggers sound across a motherboard without leaving its electrical pathways. So getting the two worlds to integrate perfectly has always been a point of contention and frustration. And this has been going on for decades now. So not only should you just use a DAW's MIDI clock for loop-based performance workflow on your standalone machines, but even when you do get the MIDI notes transmitting successfully, they're still transferring the native clock of your modern DAW compared to the original soul, if we can call it that, of vintage drum machine clocks. Most of the decision for when to use this method depends on what kind of result you're after. Not everything is that necessary to have slaving drum machines or vice versa, but knowing another technique like this would be a good trick to have up your sleeve, especially if you have no way of syncing on devices at all. So for those of you that are interested, I've made all these multi-track files available for download in the ToneLab Facebook group. So even if you don't have an 8-input interface or an 808 or an MPC, you can try the trick out yourself. And I'm always interested to hear what other techniques of tracking others might be using. So feel free to share any other wisdom or methods you might be using in the comments section, along with any ideas of how to phase lock tracks in Pro Tools, Studio One, Cubase, or any others for that matter. And so that's it for this clip. I hope that's helped you out. If it has, let me know by hitting the thumbs up, subscribe, and check out the channel for more tech tips just like this one. Thanks for watching, take care, and bye for now.